Greetings and salutations, my fellow sovereigns. This is the Vocational Science Freedom Makeup class for yesterday on Saturday night, and we will be continuing our reading from a Zerohedge article regarding the corporate state. And we left off on that article about halfway down, 1871. Now, this article is titled, "What if the America you pledge allegiance to isn't the one running the show? The Corporate Veil, America's Hidden Transformation." This is authored by Joshua Stylman at Substack. And Zerohedge picked up this article, and it's basically a very rudimentary rundown of how the United States Federal Corporation became. There's more detail to be had in the whole history of this. And to fill in that history, I have given everybody the Vocational Science of Freedom timeline doc. Now, the entire timeline course, which was an all-day course, can be watched on the Vocational Science of Freedom Odysee page. And all you have to do is just go to the Odysee page, click on playlists, and then go down to the VSOF timeline class down here. It's the same timeline doc that we'll be reading from tonight, except very shortly I'll be updating it with 5 years of information that I've collected since I did the class. And then I'll do another class on it, which will probably be a full 2-day class because I barely had enough time to get through the timeline doc as it was before. And it's going to have a lot more information added to it. So intermixed with this, I'll have our VSOF timeline doc up. We can follow along and flip back and forth between the information between the timeline doc and what this article has to say. Okay, so we left off at 1871. So the 1871 Act and DC reorganization. The Act established a quote-unquote municipal corporation for DC with specific language that differs markedly from previous founding documents. What's particularly intriguing is the timing, coming after a devastating civil war that had left the country financially vulnerable, and coinciding with significant changes in international finance. Now, break that down a little bit. The timing, yes, after the devastating Civil War. So during the Civil War, the Republic was basically bankrupted. And Lincoln was killed for creating the greenback, which was a debt-free currency because he didn't want to take the loans from the international banking cartel. And clearly they wanted to reestablish another central bank. And that was part and parcel of the whole reason for the Civil War anyway. And I don't want to get into all of the rest of the actors and subterfuge that happened pretense to that war. But needless to say, there was a lot of international interests that wanted the United States destroyed. They did not want this republic to continue. They did not want the rest of the world, I should say the rest of the people of the world, to think that they could, at any point in time, as we did, revolt against their so-called masters and decide to actually be self-governing. Now, with that said, as far as the time is concerned and what happened pretense to it, there are some things in the timeline doc that do coincide with this. And there were some things that happened just prior to the 1871 DC Act. I can scroll up here. The 14th Amendment was one of them, the supposed 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment was never actually properly ratified. And also the other thing that happened was Congress passed the expatriation bill. Now, these two things, the expatriation bill and the supposed passing of the 14th Amendment, very much go hand in hand as to what they had to do. And who, basically meaning the attorney. So what the attorney had to do is they had to give themselves a way out and give everybody else a way out as well, who were people of the several states of the American Union. Because if they did not do this, it would basically be, well, not only treason, but it would also be a form of forced indentured servitude, basically a lighter form of slavery, if you will. because they would be forcing you into a secondary class of citizenship. Now, the way that they did do it was basically by force, fraud, lies, coercion, and later on in history, by contracts and pledges that you know very little about, but which control the totality of all of your rights in America. And I highly suggest the two classes that everybody watch are the presumptions class, which are on the Vocational Science of Freedom on every platform in the playlists. So the presumptions class of rebuttable presumptions, how tyrants and black-robed priests enslaved the world. It's an all-day class, and it's a critical class to understand all of the rest of this connection, as is the reading of USA, the Republic that no one lives in, and as is the redemption of your state class, and also specifically just the status doc classes, which start off by giving you the underlying importance of how your estates are stolen by fraud at birth. This single class is one of the most important classes to watch. I break down how the system works, how they're doing what they're doing in connection with all of the rest of what they did during and after the Civil War. Okay, so just want to give the rest of the context of this because it's much, much deeper even than just what I have in the timeline doc, okay? To get back to this little part just before we get to 1871 here, okay? So you've got the Congress passed the expatriation bill. A declaration of expatriation cannot be denied by any member of government. This was so that all the bar members who knew of the passage of this act could basically expatriate out of being a United States citizen under the non-ratified 14th Amendment and therefore not become public property like the former slaves were to become, and as well as everyone else over time by force, fraud, lies, and coercion. The bill itself is 15 Stat 223 and 224 during the 1859 to 1869, an act concerning the rights of American citizens in foreign states. July 27th, 1868. Rights of American citizens. Now, that's an important distinction here. It doesn't say citizens of the United States. It says American citizens. Okay? So rights of American citizens in foreign states. Now, foreign states, what is that referring to? Well, what happened after the Civil War is that all of the states, but specifically the southern states to begin with, they were considered to be conquered territories. To this day, they still are. And if you dispute that, just write the Congressional Research Committee and ask them point blank, and they'll tell you, yes, they are. So this happened basically during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. And they put all this through, and then they did the Expatriation Act to allow themselves a way out, basically. Okay, so to continue reading from the Expatriation Act. Right of expatriation declared. Protection to naturalized citizens in foreign states. Release of citizens imprisoned by foreign governments to be demanded. Facts to be communicated to Congress. Quote, whereas the right of expatriation is a natural and inherent right of all people, notice that, the word people, not persons, indispensable to the enjoyment of the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And whereas in the recognition of this principle, this government, and this is still referring to the Republic, this government has freely received immigrants from all nations and invested them with the rights of citizenship. And whereas it is claimed that such American citizens with their descendants are subject of foreign states owing allegiance to the governments thereof, and whereas it is necessary to maintain the public peace, because they realized that if they forced everybody to be a citizen of the United States, basically a second-class citizen of Washington, D.C., that they would have a full-on revolution far, far greater than literally the Civil War that they just went through. So to the maintenance of public peace, that this claim of foreign allegiance should be promptly and finally disavowed. And this is also that part of the Expatriation Act which allows you to get out of this. So therefore, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any declaration, instruction, opinion, order, or decision of any officers of, again, this government, because we're still dealing with the republic here, which denies, restricts, impairs, or questions the right of expatriation, is hereby declared inconsistent with the fundamental principles of this government. Section 2. And be it further enacted that all naturalized citizens of the United States, now notice that's two different terms now. You have American citizens and now you have citizens of the United States, while in foreign states shall be entitled to, not have the right of, but be entitled to, and shall receive from this government the same protection of persons and property that is accorded to native-born citizens in like situations and circumstances. And notice they use the word persons and property, not people. Okay. Section 3. And be it further enacted that whenever it shall be made known to the President that any citizen of the United States, again, that's that second class of citizenship, has been unjustly deprived of his liberty by or under the authority of any foreign government, it shall be the duty of the President forthwith to demand of that government the reasons for such imprisonment, and if it appears to be wrongful and in violation of the rights of American citizenship, the President shall forthwith demand the release of such citizen, and if the release be so demanded is unreasonably delayed or refused, it shall be the duty of the President to use such means, not amounting to acts of war, as he may think necessary and proper to obtain or effectuate such release. And all the facts and proceedings relative thereto shall as soon be practicable be communicated by the President to Congress, approved July 27th, 1868. So that was that. And that's what they had to do, basically, to allow everybody a way out. Now, notice, again, there's two different forms of citizenship clearly stated within the Expatriation Act. Now, the 14th Amendment was supposedly passed by the United States Incorporated. The Federalists made their Declaration of United States jurisdiction in the form and manner of the 14th Article Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. Of course, there's the whole entire congressional record that shows that this thing was never properly ratified. So let's just put that as an aside, that the thing isn't even lawful to begin with. But anyway, this was their ruse. This is what they were trying to do. Section 1, all persons. Now, a person and a people are two different things. A person is an infant, which we spoke about last class, so I'm not going to need to rehash that. Born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Okay, are we the people, as the sovereignty of the Republic, subject to anything except our own will? Answer, no. Unless you want to consider that we are technically subject to a grand jury of our peerage that's made up of 25 other sovereigns. That's technically the only thing that we are really subject to. Aside from all of the things that you willfully subject yourself to by contract, trust, pledge, bond, or oath. That's a different story, because now you're dealing with contractual matters that you, by your own will, decided to enter into. Or, granted, that you are bound by presumption because they happen to you previous to you coming of full age and saying, hey, wait a second, I never agreed to this. So to continue with this 14th Amendment. All right. And subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So that's, if you're going to be a citizen of the United States, you are subject to the jurisdiction of Congress. That's just flat out end of story. Okay. To continue. Are citizens of the United States, and the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Okay. So while the 13th Amendment abolished private ownership of people, the 14th Amendment made it possible the public ownership of citizens of the United States as being subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And it has never been properly ratified and is being used to destroy the Republic by stating that those who are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States are citizens of the United States. And we, the people, are not subject. And then I have a little link as far as the understanding of the 14th Amendment. I believe it was Dan Smoot's breakdown of the fact that the 14th Amendment was never properly ratified. So to continue from the timeline doc. So we, the sovereign people, are not subject to the government we created. in or about 1871 under the banner of the census of enumeration directed to be taken within every subsequent term of 10 years, the formal practice of birth registration was begun. Thereafter, recording births in the Bureau of the Census Department of Commerce. Now, I need exact dates on this. Because I put that as a reference point, but that would make sense that they started the birth registration right after they decided to create this secondary citizenship. Okay. So that's the timeline of the Expatriation Act and the 14th Amendment. Okay. Now let's go back to the article and let's continue reading over here. Okay. So the text of the act preserved in the Library of Congress. Now this, again, remember they're talking about the Municipal Corporation Act here. So the text of the act preserved in the Library of Congress, 41st Congress, Session 3, Chapter 62. It's not extremely lengthy, but it's longer than what I want to read tonight, so I'm not going to go ahead and read it, but you guys are welcome to click on the link and follow it. Specifically states in Section 2 that it, quote, created a body corporate for municipal purposes, close quote, with the power to, quote, contract and be contracted with, sue and be sued, plead and be impleaded, have a seal, and exercise all other powers of a municipal corporation, close quote. This corporate designation, while ostensibly for administrative efficiency, uses language typically reserved for commercial entities rather than sovereigns. A fact noted in subsequent Supreme Court cases, including Metropolitan Railroad Company versus District of Columbia, which was 1889, which affirmed D.C.'s status as a municipal corporation having a right to sue and be sued. Modern legal scholars remain divided on the broader implications of this act. I'm sure they would be, because all attorneys want to pretend like this thing never happened. Because the totality of what the D.C. Municipal Act truly is the retaking of the administration of all of the United States by the attorney through and by the wants and the wills of what's called the Anglo-American establishment. Basically, that gets you into the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Cecil Rhodes, the Rhodes Round Table, the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, and every other group and level of fuckery that wants to go against and destroy the Republic. Basically, all of them working together. And I know that's a lot of detail that I'm not going to go over, but if people want to watch the rest of the timeline class, they'll get the point. So this was their culmination. After the Civil War, destroy the nation, bankrupt the Republic, kill Lincoln, and then create this monster. That was the whole plan. Okay, so to continue. Conventional interpretations, such as those expressed by constitutional scholar Eckley Reed Amar, view it as a pragmatic municipal reorganization with limited scope beyond the district itself. However, the timing and language of the act, coinciding with significant shifts in international finance during a period of national rebuilding, also referred to as the Reconstruction Acts, invites deeper examination. Rather than arguing, as some have done, that this act definitively transformed the entire nation into a corporation, we might more accurately observe that it represented a significant step in a broader pattern of governance changes that accelerated in the decades that followed, particularly in how the relationship between citizens, government, and financial institutions evolved. Right. Another way of saying this, or I should say the more correct way of saying this was the transformation of being able to finally push aside and minimize, not necessarily destroy, but definitely minimize the common law and to fully implement Roman civil law over and against everyone here in America. Because there is a monumental difference between those two forms of law, between common law and Roman civil law. And Roman civil law has everything to do with creating municipal corporations and then administering people through those corporations. And I cover a lot of that in the totality of law class, the differences between these different forms of law. Okay. But that's what this was all about. It was about pulling Roman civil law and also I would definitely say the law merchant and maritime admiralty law above and over top of everybody, so that the law merchant, the attorney, the bankers, the insurance companies certainly could all then control everything the way that they wanted to without having this pesky thing called individual sovereignty getting in their way, and having pesky things like petite juries being able to nullify their law, right? That's kind of a problem when you're trying to take over the entire world and destroy a republic, which doesn't allow for that. But to continue. So the distinction between Washington, D.C. as a government entity and corporate structures bearing similar names deserves careful examination. In 1925, a corporation called the United States Corporation Company was indeed chartered in Florida. See Articles of Incorporation filed July 15th, 1925. However, rather than being a federal government itself, this entity appears to have been a corporate services provider whose stated purposes include acting as a fiscal or transfer agent and helping form other corporations. Its authorized capital was a modest $500 with only 100 shares and 3 initial directors from New York. A company's connection to government remains debated. Right. This is when people go and find little things like this really doesn't have anything to do with the understanding of what Washington, D.C. is. People will go and look for things like this and they'll go, look, it's just a ruse. Look, there's corporations like this named all over the place. Whatever. It's a red herring. This has nothing to do with what the Washington, D.C. Municipal Act did. Okay. So this company's connection with government remains debated. Some researchers note its offices, blah, 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 coincided with the address used by the Federal Reserve operations, while mainstream historians regard it as simply one of the many corporate services providers established during that period of American business expansion. Right. I wouldn't put any interest nor waste my time looking into anything like that. Our focus is on what DC is and what they did, not trying to chase down other little corporations that might have some similar name. All right, to continue, it's important to distinguish between adopting corporate-style management principles and actual corporate conversion. What the evidence suggests is not that the United States literally became a corporation, but rather that governance increasingly adopted corporate-style features, right, i.e. Roman civil law. Centralized management, administrative hierarchies, separated from stakeholders, citizens, and operation through legal framework more aligned with commercial than constitutional principles. Again, that's municipal organization, also known as Roman civil law. This distinction matters because it acknowledges the nuance in this historical development. The congressional debate surrounding the 1871 Act focused primarily on administrative efficiency rather than constitutional transformation. Representative Halbert E. Payne, who reported the bill, described it as addressing the inconvenient and cumbersome organization of the district's government, with discussions centered on practical governance challenges rather than fundamental sovereignty questions. International banking developments. Building on Coos' documentation of the City of London's influence mentioned earlier, additional sources provide further context about international financial developments during this period. The Prussiagate series by Will Zoll provides extensive documentation on how central banking systems evolved across multiple countries, often using nearly identical legislation despite different cultural and economic contexts. Exactly. All of the world's bankers, the international banking cartel, with the Rothschilds at the head of it, they all wanted to control every single government through and by central banking control. This makes perfect sense, okay? And there were some other things that were also going on just before 1871 as well. In fact, I have here 1870, July 1st, the Department of Justice was created. Why'd they do that? So that was set up to say, okay, we're going to have this department that we're going to be able to go after people regarding what? Breaking Roman civil law, which is what the vast majority of all the United States Code is. And also in the 1870s, Oxford professor John Ruskin embraced Alfred Lord Tennyson's vision with students, persuading them that, quote, they had a moral obligation to disseminate English culture and unite the world under British rule. Close quote. By early 1900s, many held strategic positions in the English government, but none of his disciples would further the vision more effectively than Cecil Rhodes. Now, I don't want to get into the whole entire history of Cecil Rhodes, but if you go down that rabbit hole, you'll realize how influential Cecil Rhodes was. He also created the Rhodes Scholars, right? Like Rachel Maddow is a Rhodes Scholar. Bill Clinton is a Rhodes Scholar. Everyone who is a Rhodes Scholar has one single purpose, and is to bring America back under English control. Don't believe me? Go look into it. I'm not going to hash it out here, but it's important to understand that this is where they started to come back over the top, as what we took from England by force of arms, they have taken back from us by force of insight. Okay? So I'm going to go flipping back and forth here. So I'm going to flip back over to the timeline. Okay, so 1871, the corporate Congress begins to set up shop for itself by creating a separate government for the District of Columbia. Also in 1871, the corporate Congress claims to own all United States corporations. 41st Congress, 3rd session, chapters 62, 63, 64, 65. I have to verify that. That was something that I got from somebody else, but I need to go track it down. It wouldn't surprise me, though. It kind of makes perfect sense. Because all the charterability would have then been wrapped up. Because if you have chartered corporations under a state, but then the states are considered conquered territories of a supposedly higher authority, well, then that higher authority would then take over the charterability of said corporations. Then the District of D.C. incorporating a municipal city-state government for the District of Columbia. Proof of this corporation can be found in United States Code, Title 28, 3002, 15A. I think I'll skip reading this part about Albert Pike. We don't need to get into the Illuminati, but if you guys want to read that, this is also part and parcel of what was happening right around that time as well. I will read this, however, because this is another important aspect of what they were doing around the world. So as the article talks about that there were moves across the entire planet to set up central banks, well, there was also other things going on too as far as legislative changes were concerned. So also in 1871, English law. Beginning from 1871, further historic changes to the administration of, quote, vital statistics, such as birth certificates and death certificates, with the introduction of health districts or sanitary districts. The Local Government Act of 1871, now again, this is English law, not American, but it all ties in. Public Health Act 1872 and Public Health Act 1875 created a system of districts called sanitary districts, governed by a sanitary authority, responsible for various public health matters, including mental health, legally known as sanity. Two types of sanitary districts were created, being urban and rural. While the sanitary districts were abolished in 1894 with the Local Government Act of 1894, the administration of the poor, quote unquote, is still maintained in part under the concept of district health boards of guardians, including magistrates and other justices of the peace. So we have right here the same kind of thing going on in England, where they wanted to administer everyone. So how did they start administering people? They started to go after the poor and those who they considered to be insane or not having sanity, right? And you're going to find this tactic still to this day in these private for-profit courts that are in America. What's the first thing that the attorney does when you actually stand on your rights in one of these private for-profit courts? They'll say, oh, we got to have a fitness hearing, which means they're going to try and call you crazy. And then they'll put you in a straitjacket and put you in a psych ward because you're actually standing upon your substantive rights and you know what they're doing. That's what they revert to. But they set all that up prior to running everybody over in 1913 and 1933, which we'll get to. Okay. So back to the article. Okay, so Treasury archives confirm that banking families like the Rothschilds maintained correspondence specifically discussing central banking structures with government officials across national boundaries during this period, suggesting coordination that transcended national interests. Exactly. Zoll's research presents compelling evidence that the City of London Corporation operated with remarkable independence from British law, which I totally covered last class, functioning almost as a sovereign entity within Britain, which is exactly how they do function because they were set up in 43 AD by the Romans, and it's always been a separate city-state, and it's always had its own governance. But to continue, financial records confirm its status as a free trade zone since the 11th century, which its formation was in 43 AD, but there's been numerous legislation regarding the governance of the City of London, but I don't get into all that. So creating a unique structure that attracted banking operations from throughout Europe, which is, of course, why the English Central Bank, which was set up by the Rothschilds, has its establishment, place of business within the City of London. The historical evidence suggests patterns worth investigating. Economic crises followed by coordinated media messaging, followed by legislation that centralized financial power. This sequence appears repeatedly in Treasury records and congressional debates preceding the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Because, if a lot of people don't know this, there was let's call it the first Great Depression, if you will. Not the second one that everybody knows about. There was one previous to 1913 of which they did exactly the same thing to cause a panic and to say, oh, we need a central bank. So that's where this starts to get into. And I have here, just to go over to the timeline, 1875 banking history, January 1st. On January 1st, Jacob Schiff, now Solomon Loeb's son-in-law, after marrying his daughter, Tesra, takes control of the banking house Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Schiff goes on to finance the Standard Oil Company of crypto Jew John D. Rockefeller. He also finances Edward H. Harriman's railroad empire and Andrew Carnegie's steel empire. This is all with Rothschild money. He then identifies the other largest bankers in America at that time. They are J.P. Morgan, who controls Wall Street, and the Drexels and the Biddles of Philadelphia. All the other financiers, large and small, would dance to the tune of those three houses. Schiff then gets the European Rothschilds to set up European branches of these three large banks, and understanding that Schiff, and therefore Rothschild, is to be the boss of banking in New York, and therefore America. N.M. Rothschild and Sons undertake a share issue to raise capital for the first Channel Tunnel project to link France to England, with half of its capital coming from Rothschild-owned Champagne du Chemin de Fer du Nord. The Rothschilds needed to control the Suez Canal to protect their huge business interests in the region. So Lionel de Rothschild instructs Khazarian Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli to purchase the shares of the Suez Canal from Khedive Said of Egypt. The Rothschilds loaned the money to the British government to finance this purchase. They did not want to own it themselves, obviously, as they needed a government they controlled to own it, so that they could use the military of that government to protect it. So that's some of the history of 1875, more history of 1875, American banking history. So the American Bankers Association, the ABA, is a Washington, D.C. based trade association for the U.S. banking industry, founded in 1875. ABA today represents banks of all sizes and charters, including community banks, regional and money center banks, savings associations, mutual savings banks, and trust companies, with the average member bank having approximately $250 million in assets. And I believe I pulled this from Wikipedia. 1, like many large trade associations, ABA's principal activities include lobbying, right? Professional development for member institutions. That just means get their people in places of power. Maintenance of best practices and industry standards. Basically, anybody that comes along, they have to follow to our tune or get booted. For example, routing transit numbers, and this gets into the whole SWIFT system, which I won't get into. Customer education and distribution of products and services, also dealing with SWIFT. ABA is considered the largest financial trade group in the United States. But again, when was it established, right? before 1913, right in between this time. So they hit the ground running as hard as they could after they set up their little DC corporation. All right, now back over to the article. Transformation of governance, 1913 to 1933. Mechanisms of control, historical context. In the document shared from Michael A. Aquino's work, Mind War, introduces concepts about psychological influence that provide an illuminating framework for examining historical events. And I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm probably going to butcher this. I would say Aquino. It's probably totally wrong, but anyway, I'll just state it. Aquino, notably a former military intelligence officer who founded the Temple of Set after leaving the Church of Satan, identified specific patterns in how public opinion is systematically shaped. His analytical concepts, including false flag operations, events staged to appear as if conducted by others, and drumbeating, the repetition of claims until they're accepted as truth, regardless of evidence, which is just another way to say the use of logical fallacies until people believe the lies. And Aquino's frameworks raise compelling questions about how public perception has been influenced throughout history, despite their controversial origins. Clearly, not only is this showing who your actual enemy is, it's the Luciferian dark occultists. Now, I don't care what race they are. I don't care what flag they fly. I don't care which star they decide to worship, if you catch my drift. If they're Luciferian and they're a dark occultist and they follow the Luciferian mindset, they are your mortal enemy. Okay? Now, I know a lot of people just like to lump all the Jews into that scenario, but they're not all part of it, because there are some that are Orthodox that want nothing to do with it and clearly state that they want nothing to do with Zionism and that they say that Israel is the greatest abomination in the world, which I tend to agree with. So I simply refer to these people as Luciferian dark occultists. I can't really come up with a better term for it that pretty much encompasses all of what they are, regardless of the race that they may or may not be. Okay. So, and based on that last paragraph, clearly makes a point that that's exactly what they are and exactly what they're doing. And by the way, the Church of Satan, which was a low-level recruiting organization, if you will, which was run by Anton LaVey, who's dead now, also very deep into psychological persuasion. His whole organization was basically about that. It was basically to weed out and find good little Satanists that might be useful to them as far as perpetuating their ideology. So, and Temple of Set also same kind of thing. So to understand that more, I would suggest people, because this is not the focus of the VSOF. Our focus is more on civics, law, and the history of banking. But someone who has the best understanding of the Luciferian mindset and understands the dark occult probably better than anybody else out there right now is Mark Passio. I would say also that there's a few others out there as well that also are very good teachers regarding the dark occult. Michael Tessarian's also another one, of which I do have several of their lectures on the VSOF posted already. So, but anyway, to continue here. So historical records show coordinated messages across multiple publications and political speeches in the periods preceding major financial reforms. For example, the banking panics of 1893, which was the kind of the pre-Great Depression, as I was referring to, and 1907 were followed by remarkably similar narratives in major newspapers about the need for what? Centralized banking. Despite the fact that these same publications had previously opposed such measures. Right. Because who did they get bought up by? The same people that wanted those control mechanisms in place. The pattern recognition approach helps us identify when seemingly independent institutions are acting in coordination. When we examine major policy shifts like those during Wilson's administration, following the money often reveals motivations that official histories omit. So Wilson's administrative state, the paradigm shift. And here we go with where this whole thing takes another massive ramp up. So I'm going to just hold and pause here before we get into Edward Mandell House and Wilson. I'm going to go back to the timeline here. So 1880, Rothschild agents begin fomenting a series of programs, predominantly in Russia, but also in Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. These programs result in the slaughter of thousands of Jews, causing approximately 2 million to flee, mainly in New York, but also into Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and Los Angeles. However, some are assisted by the Rothschild money to begin settling in Palestine. The reason these programs were initiated was to create a large basic Jew movement base in America who, when they arrived, would be educated to register as Democrat voters. Yeah. Some 20 years later, this would result in a massive Democratic power base in the United States and be used to elect Rothschild frontmen such as Woodrow Wilson to the presidency to carry out the bidding of the Rothschilds, which is to sign the Federal Reserve Act. 1884, banking history. In Juilliard versus Greenman, the Supreme Court upheld the United States in reneging on its promise to redeem its paper by allowing its money trust to enter a silent interpleader, whereupon judicial notice was taken of a third-party contract resulting from Juilliard using his commercial paper currency as security in a transaction for his 100 bales of cotton, thus promoting the practice of discharging debt by obligatory notes instead of tendering payment for debts in lawful and substantive money in dollars by weight of gold or silver. So they ran this little case through first to say, well, all of you little people, meaning the citizens of the United States, can discharge your debt with our little funny monopoly money, and that's okay. It's basically what the Supreme Court said. Now, technically, in a sense, was that lawful? Yes and no. Yes, because those who do not have the rights protected by the Constitution, therefore, aren't protected from the standpoint that no state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender of payment of debt. So when you become a second-class citizen and you're using their monopoly money, this is the type of shit you run into. The connection with the Supreme Court, in this case, Juilliard versus Greenman, okay? Also, 1885, son of Lionel D. Rothschild becomes the first peer of England, takes the title of Lord Rothschild. That's not something to be overlooked at this time. Maritime Law, Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, was a regulatory agency in the United States created by Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. So again, this is the connection in where you get Roman civil law, along with maritime admiralty law, along with the law merchant, all coming over the top of our common law, right? Okay, so this is all this legislation that they're going to wrap up and they're going to be getting more and more and more of up till 1913. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's Interstate Commerce Commission, there's the Tucker Act, there's the American Bar Association recommends that other states follow the New York's lead. This is the start of the Commission on Uniform State Laws, and the Uniform State Law Commission is a monster in and of itself, and I don't want to get into all of it, but it's connected in the rest of the timeline doc. I'm just trying to get to 1913 here. So 1891, Rhodes Secret Society, the Society of the Elect, is formally established. This gets into with William Steed, Milner's Roundtable, and how Cecil Rhodes kind of ends up controlling a lot of the international policies of America. Okay, more things on the Commission on Uniform State Laws. A lot of stuff actually happened during that period of time to get into the Commission on Uniform State Laws, because they had to create this monster to be able to basically get rid of all of the individual common law of the states, or to basically squish it in a way that they were going to run everything by the law merchant. So that's why you see all of these passages of CLU in here during this period of time leading up to 1913. Okay. So, right. So I just kind of went through that really fast, but I'm just going to scroll to 1913 so we can go back to the article here. So the connection with Wilson. Okay, so Wilson's administrative state, the paradigm shift. Edward Mandell House, commonly known as Colonel House, though he never served in the military, the title being honorary in Texas, was President Wilson's most trusted advisor and confidant from 1912 to 1919. Basically, not to put too fine a point on it, Wilson was basically House's thrall. He totally controlled him, spiritually, mentally, all of it. And Wilson was blackmailed from very early on. He had an affair with some student because he used to be a professor, and they had dirt on him, and then they pushed him into being president because they knew they could control him. This is all the same type of shit that still goes on with the connection of everything from, well, obviously the entire Epstein list, right? That's just magnified like 1,000 times over. But it was happening way back then as well. Okay, so to continue. Born to English immigrant parents with banking connections, they're just talking about House again. House was a wealthy Texan with deep ties to international financial elites. Before advising Wilson, he orchestrated the election of several Texas governors and cultivated relationships with banking and industrial power players in both America and Europe. House was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve. Aligning U.S. monetary policy with global banking interests. Now, I'm going to just pause here for a second because I want to make a point about this, that I have an entire class about House, and it's very, very important that everybody actually watch it. And it should be under self-governance. And okay, it's a little bit deeper in that as far as on the playlist on YouTube, but I'm going to go back and take a look at Rumble. This one. So how the Republic was stolen. This is the one you want to go back and watch regarding House, okay? So I totally cover everything that he did with Wilson in this hour and a half. And I also lay out completely what the plan was from Wilson's administration forward to 1933 and what they did when they totally took everything over. And that's continued in these two classes here, which is the Destruction of America Part 1, the New Bad Deal, and Destruction of America Part 2, how they administer your estate from 1933 till now. So you watch the House one, then you watch these two, and they'll give you a total connection as to everything that they've been doing from then, from 1913, starting with House onward, okay? So just want to make sure that you guys have that extra connection because you'll definitely want to watch them to get the total understanding of what House did. So connected to banking interests, so on and so forth. All right. He was also a founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Why is that not surprising? A key architect of the Treaty of Versailles and a driving force between the League of Nations, which laid the groundwork for modern supranational governments. His 1912 political novel, Philip Drew Administrator, eerily foreshadowed Wilson-era policies. And in this book, which is a hard read because he's not that good of a writer, basically Philip Drew is Edward Mandell House himself. He basically wrote the book as his own little character and what he was going to do, okay? So, describing an idolized dictator who implements sweeping progressive reforms through executive authority rather than democratic means. Despite holding no official government position, House wielded influence over Wilson's administration in a way that modern observers might compare to the role of unelected power brokers in contemporary politics. As I said, Wilson was basically his thrall. If you don't know what that word is, go look it up. The mysterious nature of House's influence was captured by House himself when he wrote in his diary, "The president is not a strong character, but is by no means as weak as he appears. He has an analytical mind, but not much executive ability, and has a single-track mind." In 1887, essay, quote, "The Study of Administration," close quote, Wilson explicitly advocated for a government run by experts, insulated from public opinion. The field of administration is a field of business. It is removed from the hurry and strife of politics. Administrative questions are not political questions. He argued directly that the many have no business with the selection of technical administrators any more than they have with the selection of scientists. So in this, you're starting to see the technocratic state being created, right? Where eventually you get to things like 1984 and Brave New World, literally, which is what we're seeing right now coming into fruition. These writings reveal Wilson's profound belief in governance by unelected technical experts rather than democratic processes, a vision that laid the groundwork for the modern administrative state. True. This philosophy of governance, creating a permanent administrative class operating independently of elected officials, marks a profound departure from the constitutional system established by the founders. James Madison's writing in the Federalist Papers explicitly warned against exactly this type of arrangement, where unelected officials would hold unchecked power over citizens. The relationship between Colonel House and Wilson point towards questions about the intentionality behind administrative systems developed during this period. As we'll see later, this vision would eventually extend beyond domestic agencies to reshape global governance itself. Right, because once you have total control of the entire United States Federal Corporation, you have total control of its military, which you can then use to police or bully or kill anybody else across the entire planet that isn't going along with your agenda. But to continue, what can be verified in the historical records is that during Wilson's administration, several mechanisms were indeed established that fundamentally altered the relationship between citizens and government, including the Federal Reserve System, income taxation, and later the Social Security system with its universal numerical identification. These systems, while presented as public benefits, effectively created traceable financial identities that constitutional scholars like Edwin Vieira Jr. have analyzed as potential instruments of financial monitoring and control. As Vieira argues, these mechanisms transform the citizen-state relationship into one increasingly mediated through financial institutions rather than direct constitutional protections. Exactly. Now, to break this down a little bit further, anyone who has a Social Security number and quote unquote pays their income tax, if you have a Social Security number, you are considered to be what's called federal personnel. You're basically working for the federal government, which is why they can tax it, because the Supreme Court has said multiple times that the 16th Amendment gave the federal government no new taxing powers. Just people don't realize what they're talking about when they read those court cases. Okay, they don't have the power to tax you as one of the people. They do, however, have the power to tax you as one of their own little employees. So this is part and parcel of what you have to do to get rid of all of these private little trusts, pledges, bonds, oaths, contracts, and other things that you have with the corporate state. This is the reason why we created the Vocational Science Freedom Status Doc Set, to remove yourself from all of these little things that create the presumptions that put you under their boot. But to continue, Wilson's vision was deeply intertwined with both class and racial prejudices. Historical records document his belief that only people of a certain education, social class, and background possess the capacity for wise governance of everyone else. In the name of democracy, he effectually advocated for the class oligarchy as the ruling paradigm. As Jeffrey Tucker has noted in his analysis of Wilson's ideology, quote, "We find the roots of the ideology of the administrative state in the works of Woodrow Wilson, and it takes only a minute of reading his deluded fantasies of how science and compulsion would forge a better world to see that it was only a matter of time before the whole experiment was in tatters." Close quote. This dream, a government of administrative agencies informed by captured science, has increasingly lost credibility, particularly after the governmental failures witnessed during the COVID era. Yeah, I don't want to get into all that, but the simple answer is yes. This administrative state laid the essential groundwork for today's technocratic governance, right, which is the better way to understand all this. There's a really great documentary called Technocracy Rising which I highly suggest that everybody also watch. I don't have that re-uploaded, but I do highly suggest that you make a note right now. Just write it down. Technocracy Rising, and go watch it, because it talks about all of this. So this administrative state led the essential groundwork for today's technocratic governance, the fusion of unelected bureaucracy with digital technologies that creates unprecedented capabilities for population management through automated systems and algorithmic decision-making. Metadata, anyone? The corporate implications of the 1871 reorganization were further reinforced in subsequent court decisions. Hoover and Allison Company versus Evatt, which was in 1945, the Supreme Court distinguished between different meanings of United States. Right. Technically, there's three of them, including the United States as a sovereign entity versus a federal corporation. And then there's the third one, which is the United States, meaning the several states of the American Union. Okay, so those are the three types, or the three aspects of the United States, what they can be. Okay. And then Clearfield Trust Company versus U.S., 1943, the court held that, quote, the United States does business on business terms, close quote. When it issues commercial paper, a ruling that confirmed the federal government's capacity to function as a commercial entity rather than solely as a sovereign power. What's particularly striking about Wilson's administrative vision is how perfectly it aligns with the potential corporate transformation represented by the 1871 Act. Both replace government by consent. That's the biggest word right there. Both replace government by consent. You consent to all this by putting your little hand with a pen in it on a piece of paper and signing something. Whether that be a IRS form, whether it be a document for registration, whether it be a permit, whether it be a license, whatever, nobody bothers to read the small print. In all of those things, every single time that you do anything like that with the government, it's always going to have in the small print that you agree that you are a citizen of the United States. And with that, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. But they don't tend to put that in the contract. They wouldn't want to actually remind you of that little annoying fact. But trust me, that's how you enter into it. You enter into it by consent, right here, usually by document. But if you watch the VSOF class about how they steal your estates by fraud at birth, much of this is also done by presumption, because a lot of this happens prior to you even having the capacity to even understand what a contract is. A lot of this happens when you're a baby and you don't know about any of it. And then when you get to a certain age, they start throwing contracts in front of you. And the second that you sign one of them, you consent and you make then sort of valid all of these things that were done before you reached what's called coming of full age or being of full age, which means you have the capacity to handle your own affairs. All these things happen while you were an infant. And as I explained in the last class, all of this is about the administration of abandoned infant estates. Okay. So just remember that all those things come into fruition prior to you even knowing that they were there, which is, of course, part of the ruse and part of the illegality of this. Okay, but to continue. Okay, so both replace government by consent with management by expertise. Both create structures that insulate decision makers from public accountability, right? There's your corporate state and your administrators basically administering the abandoned infant estates, and you can't argue because you're still seen as an infant. You don't have what's called standing to go after them. And furthermore, because you haven't claimed your estate, which is something else that the vocational science freedom status docs do. They actually claim back your estate. So it's not sitting out there abandoned and being able to be administered by all of this idiocy of the attorney. But anyway, to continue. Okay, so both shift power from elected representatives to unelected administrators. Exactly. If you go look up part of what's created by the Uniform Law Commission, the Uniform Probate Laws, go look up what a special administrator is. That's pretty much every single judge on the bench right now. They're all acting as special administrators. That's all they're doing. Okay. All right, to continue. The evidence suggests we should ask whether Wilson's administrative state was simply the visible manifestation of a deeper transformation that had already occurred decades earlier. Answer is yes, but all of this took time to bring together, which again is kind of what I very quickly scrolled through in the timeline doc, okay? The administrative governance model has expanded far beyond domestic agencies to encompass international institutions that exercise significant authority with minimal democratic oversight. Organizations such as the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization, the Bank for International Settlements operate through similar expert-driven technocratic frameworks. These institutions, and I could do a class on each one of these, but for the time, I'm just going to leave them there. These institutions make policy decisions affecting billions of people worldwide while remaining largely insulated from democratic processes. Right. You wouldn't want to have things like, I don't know, sovereign governments actually interfering in your world totalitarian governance. The precise governance model Wilson advocated. This represents a shift from governance based on the consent of the governed to governance by technical expertise and financial influence that transcends national borders, suggesting Wilson's vision had reached its fullest expression not in domestic bureaucracies, but in the global governance architecture that emerged in the decades following his presidency. Right. Cue in again back to Cecil Rhodes, the roundtables, and everything else that's in the timeline doc regarding that connection. All right, back to the article. Anyone who lived through the COVID-19 pandemic witnessed this model in full operation, as public health technocrats issued mandates affecting every aspect of daily life with minimal legislation oversight or democratic input. This technocratic governance model, where technical experts rather than elected representatives make consequential decisions, has expanded dramatically in recent decades. As indicated in, quote, the technocratic blueprint, close quote, technological capabilities have enabled unprecedented implementation of Wilson's vision. Okay, he's saying Wilson's vision. This is not Wilson's vision. Not in any way, shape, or form is it Wilson's vision. It was created by technocrats that had this plan long, long before Wilson ever came along. He was just their useful idiot, basically, that they could control to implement it. And that he kind of had these same ideas, or that he was more or less taught to think that this was the better way of doing things. They just used that and used him to perpetuate their global agenda. So, but to continue. All right, so creating systems where algorithms and unelected specialists increasingly determine human outcomes while maintaining the appearance of democratic processes. Okay, from that, seeing as how we've already gone almost to an hour, I think I will stop here, and we will probably have part 3 and part 4 of this. And I'm going to copy this right now and put this into the mega chat so I can remember where we left off at. And as far as that, I don't see anything else in chat other than one comment by Law regarding the sex trafficking. Yeah. And everything else going along with the international Luciferian fools. So if anybody has any other questions regarding anything that I've covered tonight, obviously everybody can feel free to post in the comments anytime that you want as far as any questions that you might have. Also, remember to make sure to go ahead and download the timeline, and the link to the timeline will always be in all of the show notes on all of the platforms. So if you go ahead and click on this class today, the mega link will be in there, and then you can download the timeline and also read the rest of it, which I highly suggest that everybody do. Or if you just like to listen to it, again, you can find the timeline class only on Odysee and on Rumble. I do not have the VSOF timeline class on YouTube for obvious reasons. Well, for reasons that will become obvious once you listen to the class. Let's put it that way. And also, if you'd also like to join the Vocational Science Freedom on either our Rumble server or also join us on the Vocational Science Freedom on Mega, which is where we hold classes on, then you can do so by going to the welcome package, which will then take you to the ways to get onto our Revolt server. And so you just, again, go to vocationalsciencefreedom.wordpress.com. That link is in all of the show notes as well. And then just click on welcome package up top and come and download the welcome package and get started to join us on both our Revolt server and on Mega. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. And I hope all of you guys are enjoying this timeline class connected to this article off Zerohedge, which has been an interesting read through. And we'll have our Wednesday night open roundtable for VSOF members on Wednesday, also at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So until then, hope all of you have a wonderful week. And until I see you on Wednesday, as always, stay safe and stay sovereign.